The Battle of Saipan, fought between June 15th and July 9th, 1944, was one of the most pivotal and brutal engagements of the Second World War's Pacific theater. Situated in the Mariana Islands, Saipan was a small speck of volcanic rock, roughly 13 miles long and 6 miles wide, yet its strategic value was enormous. To American planners, capturing Saipan meant gaining a forward base from which long-range B-29 Superfortress bombers could strike the Japanese home islands, a move that would bring the war to Tokyo's doorstep. For Japan, the loss of Saipan would mean not only a catastrophic military setback, but also a devastating psychological blow, a direct breach in the defensive perimeter that guarded the empire itself. The battle that unfolded there became a microcosm of the Pacific War's defining themes: fierce resistance, immense suffering, and the blurred boundaries between victory and tragedy. In early 1944, the momentum of the war in the Pacific had begun to shift decisively in favor of the Allies. After hard-fought victories at Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and the Marshall Islands, American forces under Admiral Chester W. Nimitz and General Douglas MacArthur advanced toward Japan through a dual-pronged strategy. The U.S. Navy and Marine Corps pursued an island-hopping campaign across the Central Pacific, capturing strategic islands while bypassing heavily fortified Japanese positions. Each captured island became an unsinkable aircraft carrier, a stepping stone toward Japan. Among the next targets chosen by American planners were the Mariana Islands, of which Saipan was the largest and most developed. Possession of Saipan, along with neighboring Tinian and Guam, would place the Japanese homeland within range of sustained aerial bombardment for the first time. The stakes could not have been higher. The Japanese High Command recognized this danger well. They fortified Saipan extensively, transforming it into a formidable fortress bristling with artillery, bunkers, and concealed defensive positions. Over 30,000 troops of the Imperial Japanese Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito and supported by Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the same naval commander who had overseen the attack on Pearl Harbor, were entrenched across the island. In addition to the soldiers, Saipan was home to more than 25,000 Japanese civilians, including settlers, families, and laborers brought from Japan and Korea. Their presence, a result of Japan's colonial expansion in Micronesia, would later turn the battle into one of the most tragic humanitarian disasters of the war. Saito and Nagumo were determined to hold Saipan at all costs. They understood that the loss of the Marianas would mean not only the collapse of Japan's outer defenses, but also the imminent threat to Emperor Hirohito's rule. For the Americans, Operation Forager, the code name for the invasion of Saipan and the Marianas, represented the culmination of months of meticulous planning. It required coordination between the Navy's Fifth Fleet, commanded by Admiral Raymond Spruance, and the Expeditionary Force under General Holland M. Smith, a hard-driving Marine officer known as Howlin' Mad. Smith's assault force comprised the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions and the 27th Infantry Division of the U.S. Army, totaling more than 71,000 men. Their mission was straightforward in theory, but perilous in execution. Establish a beachhead, seize the island, and secure it for airfield construction. In reality, it would prove to be one of the bloodiest operations in the Pacific. At dawn on June 15, 1944, the American invasion fleet, one of the largest assembled during the war, appeared on the horizon. Naval guns roared, pounding Saipan's western beaches in a relentless barrage meant to soften the defenses. The sea churned with smoke and flame as thousands of shells tore into the coastal fortifications. Yet despite the devastating bombardment, the Japanese defenders remained largely intact, sheltered in caves and fortified bunkers. As the first waves of amphibious landing craft approached the shore, they were met with withering fire from hidden machine guns, mortars, and artillery. Marines disembarked into waist-deep water, struggling to wade ashore under a storm of bullets. The beaches at Chirankanawa and Aganon Point quickly turned into killing zones littered with wrecked vehicles, burning tanks, and bodies. Still, through sheer determination, the Americans established a tenuous foothold by nightfall. The cost was enormous. Thousands of casualties on the first day alone, but Saipan was now contested ground. Over the following weeks, the battle devolved into a brutal war of attrition. The terrain, dense jungle, jagged cliffs, and volcanic ridges favored the defenders. Every advance required the Americans to root out Japanese troops from caves, pillboxes, and tunnels, often in close-quarters combat. Flamethrowers, grenades, and satchel charges became indispensable tools as entire squads fought yard by yard for control of Mount Tapochau, the highest point on the island. It became a bloody symbol of resistance. For days, Marines fought to scale its slopes under relentless fire. When they finally reached the summit, they could see the entire island and the extent of the devastation below. The fighting in Garapan, Saipan's largest town, added another layer of horror. House-to-house combat amid ruins and civilian casualties. By late June, Saipan had become a wasteland of rubble and corpses, with the surviving Japanese forces compressed into the island's northmost ridges. The battle reached its gruesome climax on July 7, 1944, with the largest banzai charge of the Pacific War. In one final act of defiance, General Saito ordered his remaining soldiers, roughly 3,000 men, including the wounded, to launch a mass suicide attack against the American lines. At dawn, with cries of "Tenno Heika Banzai," "Long live the Emperor," the Japanese surged forward in a human wave. They overran several American positions, killing hundreds in desperate hand-to-hand combat. The 105th Infantry Regiment suffered devastating losses before artillery and machine gun fire finally annihilated the attackers. The Banzai Charge, both heroic and tragic, marked the end of organized Japanese resistance. Shortly afterwards, General Saito and Admiral Nagumo took their own lives. The island was effectively secured, though sporadic fighting continued for several days. Yet perhaps the most haunting chapter of the Battle of Saipan was not fought between armies, but among civilians. Thousands of Japanese families, indoctrinated by years of propaganda that portrayed Americans as monstrous invaders, fled north as the U.S. advance continued. At the cliffs of Marpi Point, later known as Suicide Cliff and Banzai Cliff, entire families leapt to their deaths rather than surrender. American soldiers, horrified, tried desperately to stop them, shouting through loudspeakers and waving white flags, but fear and fanaticism proved stronger. Mothers threw infants from the cliffs before jumping after them. The sight traumatized even hardened veterans, many of whom later recalled it as the most unbearable moment of their service. The cliffs of Saipan thus became not only a battlefield, but a monument to the psychological and moral devastation of war. When the fighting finally ceased on July 9, 1944, Saipan was declared secure. The cost was staggering. The United States suffered more than 14,000 casualties, including over 3,400 killed. The Japanese losses were catastrophic. More than 29,000 soldiers killed and only 921 taken prisoner, along with tens of thousands of civilian dead. The island, once covered in sugarcane fields and palm trees, had been transformed into a landscape of ash and bone. But from this devastation arose a strategic turning point that would define the remainder of the Pacific War. The capture of Saipan gave the United States a crucial base for its new weapon of strategic air power, the B-29 Superfortress. Within months, American engineers built massive airfields from which bombers would launch devastating raids against Japan's cities, including Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya. The psychological effect was immediate. For the first time, Japanese citizens experienced the war firsthand. The loss of Saipan also shook the foundations of Japan's government. The defeat forced Prime Minister Hideki Tojo and his cabinet to resign, signaling a crisis of confidence within the imperial command. Strategically and symbolically, Saipan marked the beginning of the end for the Japanese Empire. Beyond its military implications, Saipan revealed the road to Saipan was paved with blood, ambition, and the relentless drive of two empires locked in a struggle for dominance across the vast Pacific Ocean. By early 1944, the tide of war had turned decisively in favor of the Allies. The United States, having clawed back from the humiliation of Pearl Harbor, now stood on the offensive, determined to break through Japan's defensive ring of island fortresses and bring the war closer to the Japanese homeland. Saipan, a small island in the Mariana chain, became the next critical step in that grand strategy. Strategically located about 1,200 miles from Tokyo, Saipan's significance could not be overstated. Its capture would allow the United States to establish air bases for the new Boeing B-29 Superfortress bombers, which could strike directly at the Japanese home islands. This would mark the first time that Japan itself would be within the reach of sustained strategic bombing. For Japan, therefore, Saipan was not merely another island. It was the outer wall protecting the emperor's realm. Losing it would mean opening the gates to invasion, both materially and psychologically. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, understood this all too well. The seizure of Saipan was to be the centerpiece of Operation Forager, a campaign designed to secure the Mariana and Palau Islands as stepping stones for the final assault on Japan. In Washington, the Joint Chiefs of Staff debated the immense risks and logistical challenges involved. Saipan was heavily fortified, and intelligence reports indicated that the Japanese garrison was well supplied and ready to fight to the death. Yet the rewards outweighed the dangers. The American High Command saw the Marianas as the linchpin of their Central Pacific strategy, a chance to bypass many smaller, heavily defended islands and strike a decisive blow at Japan's ability to wage war. The plan was audacious, to mount a massive amphibious invasion supported by overwhelming naval and air power that would overwhelm Japanese defenses before they could react effectively. Preparations for Operation Forager began months in advance. Admiral Raymond A. Spruance, commanding the Fifth Fleet, and Vice Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, the veteran of numerous amphibious assaults, were tasked with coordinating the invasion. The ground forces would be commanded by Lieutenant General Holland M. Smith, an outspoken and sometimes controversial Marine leader whose nickname Howlin' Mad reflected his fierce temperament and uncompromising standards. Under his command were the U.S. 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions, veterans of Tarawa and Rowi Namur, along with the U.S. Army's 27th Infantry Division, a unit that would later face its own trials on Saipan. The logistical challenge was enormous. Thousands of ships carrying men, tanks, artillery, supplies, and landing craft had to converge on the Marianas from as far away as Pearl Harbor and the Marshall Islands. The U.S. Navy's fast carrier task forces would spearhead the assault, softening the defenses through relentless airstrikes. Meanwhile, Seabees, the Navy's construction battalions, were tasked with building makeshift harbors, runways, and roads as soon as the beachheads were secure. Every aspect of the operation required coordination on an unprecedented scale. In many ways, the invasion of Saipan would serve as a dress rehearsal for the later even more complex operations against Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Intelligence gathering was another crucial aspect of the planning. Aerial reconnaissance flights over the Marianas provided valuable photographs of Japanese positions, airfields, and terrain. Submarines prowled the surrounding waters, collecting information and sinking Japanese shipping to isolate the island. Cryptographic breakthroughs by U.S. Navy codebreakers also gave the Americans insight into Japanese defensive strategies. They knew that the garrison, under Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito and Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the same Nagumo who had commanded the carrier force at Pearl Harbor, was determined to fight to the last man. The Japanese High Command understood the importance of Saipan as well. For them, it represented the last bastion of defense before the American juggernaut reached the inner perimeter of the empire. The Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo issued orders for an all-or-nothing defense. The soldiers stationed there, numbering around 30,000, were instructed to die rather than surrender. Reinforcements were impossible. American submarines had strangled Japanese supply lines, and their once proud navy was a shadow of its former self. Yet the Japanese defenders were resourceful and disciplined, constructing elaborate networks of bunkers, caves, and concealed artillery positions. They turned Saipan's rugged terrain into a deadly labyrinth that would exact a terrible price for the invaders. As spring turned to summer in 1944, the tension mounted. The invasion fleet gathered at Eniwatok Atoll, a sea of steel stretching to the horizon. More than 500 ships assembled, battleships, aircraft carriers, cruisers, destroyers, troop transports, and support vessels, all part of the largest amphibious force yet assembled in the Pacific. Sailors and Marines prepared their equipment, wrote final letters home, and steeled themselves for what lay ahead. Many knew that Saipan would not be easily taken. The bitter lessons of Tarawa, where over 1,000 Marines had died on the beaches, weighed heavily on their minds. For Admiral Nimitz, the stakes were both strategic and symbolic. Success on Saipan would not only bring Japan within bombing range, but also validate his Central Pacific drive over General Douglas MacArthur's preference for a southern route through the Philippines. Behind the military calculations, inter-service rivalry simmered, an undercurrent that would persist throughout the war. But for the men who would soon storm Saipan's beaches, such rivalries meant little. Their focus was survival, and the hope that victory on this distant island would hasten the end of a brutal and unforgiving war. In the days leading up to the invasion, American warships unleashed a furious bombardment on Saipan. Battleships like the USS Tennessee and USS California pounded the beaches, while carrier aircraft strafed Japanese positions and bombed supply depots. The sea shook with the thunder of naval gunfire. Yet as would soon become clear, much of the Japanese defense remained intact. Deep in caves and reinforced bunkers, the defenders waited. They had been preparing for this moment for months, rehearsing their counterattacks and digging intricate tunnel networks that allowed them to move unseen across the battlefield. American planners debated the choice of landing sites. After studying aerial photographs and terrain models, they selected the western beaches near Charon-Carano as the primary invasion area. The terrain there was relatively flat, offering a corridor toward the central plateau. But intelligence underestimated the strength of Japanese defenses and the density of coral reefs offshore, which would hinder the landing craft. As D-Day approached, commanders knew that even the best-laid plans could collapse in the chaos of battle. Beyond the strategic maps and briefings, the human element of preparation was equally intense. Marines practiced amphibious landings on simulated beaches, learned to coordinate with tanks and naval gunfire, and endured endless drills under the tropical sun. The Army's 27th Division, less experienced in amphibious warfare, trained to follow the Marines ashore once the beachhead was secure. Morale was high, though tinged with apprehension. Rumors of the ferocity of Japanese defenders, of civilians willing to die rather than surrender, circulated among the troops. Few could yet grasp the scale of the tragedy that would unfold once Saipan's civilian population was drawn into the battle. For the Japanese on the island, preparations took a darker turn. General Saito, aware of the hopelessness of his position, nevertheless resolved to inflict maximum casualties on the enemy. Propaganda told the civilians that the Americans would commit unspeakable atrocities, driving many to vow suicide rather than capture. Women and children were taught to throw themselves from cliffs or use grenades if cornered. It was a grim foreshadowing of the horrors that awaited in the final days of the battle. By early June 1944, everything was in motion. On June 11th, American carriers began their pre-invasion air raids, systematically destroying Japanese airfields and ships in the area. The skies above the Marianas were filled with smoke and fire as the once dominant Japanese Air Force crumbled under the relentless onslaught. By June 13th, naval gunfire began pounding the beaches with a ferocity unseen before. The horizon burned red at night as thousands of shells rained down on Saipan. The stage was set for the assault that would decide the fate of the Marianas, and in many ways, the course of the Pacific War. As the sun rose over the Pacific on June 15, 1944, the invasion force approached Saipan. The calm sea glimmered deceptively under the morning light. In the landing craft, Marines and soldiers checked their rifles and adjusted. At dawn on June 15, 1944, the tranquil waters off Saipan erupted in thunder. The sea trembled beneath the weight of hundreds of ships, and the horizon glowed with the fire of naval bombardment. For days, American warships had pounded the beaches, but now came the moment of truth. The invasion of Saipan had begun. It was the culmination of months of planning under Operation Forager, the most ambitious amphibious assault yet undertaken in the Pacific War. The invasion fleet was a sight unparalleled in the Pacific theater. Over 500 ships, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, carriers, and transport vessels stretched across the sea in tight formation. The Fifth Fleet, under Admiral Raymond Spruance, was the spearhead of America's Pacific might. Vice Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner directed the amphibious assault, while General Holland M. Howland Mad Smith commanded the landing forces. At 4:45 a.m., the first wave of bombardment began anew. Battleships like the USS Pennsylvania, USS Tennessee, and USS California opened fire, their 14-inch guns belching flame and steel. The ground trembled as high explosive shells pounded the beaches and inland defenses. The objective was to neutralize Japanese artillery, destroy bunkers, and soften up the terrain before the landing craft approached. However, the Japanese defenders had survived the bombardment by retreating deep into caves, tunnels, and rocks. As the naval guns fell silent, a tense quiet swept across the sea. In the amphibious transports, Marines and soldiers climbed down into their Higgins boats, the flat-bottomed landing craft that would carry them to shore. The roar of engines, the smell of diesel, and the clatter of weapons filled the air. In each craft, 30 men sat shoulder to shoulder, faces grim under their helmets. Chaplains moved among them, offering final prayers and blessings. Some men clutched rosaries. The battle for Saipan entered its most grueling and chaotic phase following the initial beachhead victories of early June 1944. The island, only 13 miles long and 6 miles wide, became a labyrinth of natural fortifications, jagged terrain, and human determination. For the American Marines and Army soldiers who pressed inland, the lush tropical beauty of Saipan belied the ferocity of the struggle awaiting them. The Japanese defenders, numbering over 30,000 under Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, had turned the island into a fortress of caves, cliffs, and hidden bunkers. Every inch of ground was contested. Every ridge and ravine concealed danger. The geography of Saipan dictated the character of the combat. The central and northern parts of the island were dominated by Mount Tapochao, a towering volcanic peak that provided commanding views of the entire battlefield. Around it stretched dense jungle, sugarcane fields, and rugged limestone cliffs. Japanese engineers and laborers had transformed this terrain into a defensive network, with caves interconnected by tunnels, machine gun nests camouflaged in vegetation, and artillery concealed in the hillsides. The Americans dubbed these strong points spider holes, but the reality was far more elaborate: an underground world where soldiers could vanish, reappear behind advancing lines, and strike with deadly precision. For the Marines of the 2nd and 4th Divisions and the soldiers of the 27th Infantry Division, progress was measured in yards, not miles. Each day brought new assaults on enemy positions hidden in caves or bunkers that could only be cleared by direct assault. Flamethrowers, demolition charges, and grenades became the tools of survival. Platoons advanced under constant sniper fire, often finding themselves ambushed from unseen openings in the rocks. Japanese troops, well aware of their impending fate, fought with fanatical resistance, frequently choosing death over retreat. The Americans faced an enemy that refused to surrender, a reality that turned Saipan into a battle of annihilation. By mid-June, the fight for Mount Tapochao had become a microcosm of the larger campaign. The mountain, rising 1,554 feet, was the strategic heart of the island. Whoever controlled it controlled the island. The Marines nicknamed it Death Mountain, and the name was no exaggeration. Japanese machine guns and mortars rained fire down the slopes, pinning American units in the open. Assaults up the steep ridges required courage bordering on madness. Men crawled on hands and knees, tossing grenades into cave mouths, while engineers blasted rock walls with satchel charges. Each foothold came at a terrible cost. When the summit was finally secured after days of bitter fighting, the Marines found themselves looking out over a devastated landscape, fields littered with wreckage, burning sugar mills, and the bodies of friend and foe alike. Urban combat was another brutal chapter in the battle for Saipan. The island's southern region, particularly the town of Garapan, once a thriving Japanese administrative center, became a shattered ruin. As the Americans closed in, Japanese soldiers and civilians alike took refuge in the buildings, fighting from windows, rooftops, and cellars. Every street became a front line. Tanks rolled cautiously through the debris-strewn avenues, their machine guns sweeping the ruins, while infantrymen moved from house to house, clearing resistance room by room. The smell of smoke and cordite filled the air. Civilians caught in the crossfire endured unimaginable terror. Many refused to surrender, conditioned by years of propaganda to believe that capture meant torture or death. Marines risked their lives trying to coax families from hiding, sometimes only to witness them leap from cliffs rather than face captivity. As American forces pushed northward, the battle's psychological toll deepened. The Japanese defense, though increasingly desperate, grew even more lethal. Kamikaze-like suicide charges, nighttime infiltrations, and booby traps haunted the invaders' every step. Sleep became a luxury. Nerves frayed under the constant threat of sudden death. For many Marines, the battle for Saipan was unlike anything they had faced before. Guadalcanal and Tarawa had been brutal, but Saipan combined every conceivable horror in one relentless campaign. The use of flamethrowers became emblematic of the struggle. Japanese soldiers concealed in caves refused to emerge even when surrounded. In response, American engineers devised systematic cave-clearing operations. Teams advanced cautiously with flamethrowers and explosives, sealing off entrances and incinerating those within. The moral cost of such methods weighed heavily on many who fought. The enemy's refusal to surrender left no alternative, yet the sight and smell of charred remains lingered long after victory. War, stripped of glory, revealed its darkest face in the bowels of Saipan's hills. By late June, the Japanese forces had been pushed back into the northern third of the island. General Saito, recognizing the inevitability of defeat, prepared for a final stand. His forces, though shattered and hungry, continued to resist with fanatical zeal. American units advanced methodically, supported by artillery and naval bombardment, but the price remained steep. Every cave cleared meant more casualties. Every advance brought new ambushes. The island had become a killing ground where neither side would yield easily. The fight for Saipan also marked a shift in American tactics. Coordination between infantry, armor, and air support became increasingly sophisticated. Marine and Army units learned to use aerial spotting to locate hidden caves, while tanks provided direct fire into the cliffs. Naval gunfire, though devastating, was often limited by the close proximity of friendly troops. The battle evolved into a deadly chess match of movement and firepower. Innovation born of necessity. In the end, Saipan's rugged beauty was transformed into a landscape of ruin. The beaches, once stained with blood, now echoed with the thunder of artillery. Hillsides were stripped bare, pockmarked by shell craters. The once proud capital of Garapan lay in smoldering ruin. And yet, amidst the devastation, the determination of both sides spoke to the extremes of human endurance. For the Americans, victory on Saipan was not just another island conquered, it was a step closer to Japan itself. For the Japanese, it was the embodiment of sacrifice in the face of hopeless odds. The fight for the island was over by early July, but its scars would never fade. The survivors, soldiers and civilians alike, carried the memories of Saipan's caves, cliffs, and burning towns for the rest of their lives. The battle had tested the limits of courage and compassion, and in doing so, had revealed the true cost of the Pacific War. Saipan was more than a strategic victory. It was a crucible of suffering and endurance that defined an era of total war. By the final days of June 1944, Saipan had become a scene of unspeakable devastation. The once lush and fertile island was reduced to a blasted wasteland of shattered trees, smoldering ruins, and bodies, both American and Japanese, strewn across the battlefield. The surviving Japanese troops, now cornered in the island's northern reaches around Mount Marpi and Tonopog Plain, faced a grim realization. Their situation was hopeless. Supplies were gone. General Yoshitsugu Saito, commanding the Japanese garrison, understood the gravity of the situation. His forces, numbering barely a few thousand effectives out of the original 30,000, were starving, wounded, and exhausted. Yet surrender was unthinkable. In his final orders, Saito declared that the time had come for one last, all-out assault. "We shall advance to attack the enemy," he wrote. "We will all die an honorable death." His words were both an exhortation and an epitaph. The night of July 6, 1944, was tense and foreboding. American units of the 27th Infantry Division and 105th Regiment of the U.S. Army, positioned along the northern defensive lines, sensed something unusual in the humid darkness. Sporadic gunfire and the eerie sounds of movement drifted from the enemy positions. Flares occasionally illuminated the night sky, revealing fleeting shadows. By midnight, it was clear that the Japanese were preparing for something extraordinary. At dawn on July 7th, as the first light crept over the ridges, the silence broke with a chilling cry, "Tenno Heika Banzai!" Long live the Emperor! Then, like a tidal wave of humanity, thousands of Japanese soldiers surged forward. They were joined by wounded men, unarmed laborers, and even civilian auxiliaries armed with sticks, bayonets, and improvised weapons. It was the largest Banzai charge of the Pacific War. The initial onslaught crashed into the American lines with ferocious intensity. The 105th Infantry Regiment bore the brunt of the assault. Many forward positions were overrun in minutes as Japanese soldiers swarmed over trenches, stabbing and clubbing in a frenzy of hand-to-hand combat. Machine guns blazed, rifles cracked, and grenades exploded in chaotic bursts. Entire platoons were cut off, surrounded, and annihilated. The Americans fought back desperately. By mid-morning, the battlefield had become a nightmare of confusion and carnage. The Japanese, though suffering appalling losses, managed to penetrate deep into the American lines. At one point, they reached the regimental command post, killing dozens of men before being driven back by artillery and tank fire. The fighting devolved into close-quarters slaughter, bayonets, knives, and fists replacing rifles as the weapons of survival. Even medics and support personnel were forced into the fray. Despite the chaos, American discipline and firepower gradually turned the tide. Artillery batteries poured shell after shell into the attacking waves, while tanks and half-tracks mowed down charging troops with 50-caliber machine guns. Mortar fire shattered the ranks of the attackers, and flamethrowers incinerated those who sought cover. The Banzai charge, initially terrifying in its momentum, soon became a massacre. Within hours, General Saito himself, grievously wounded and aware that all was lost, took his own life shortly thereafter. In his final message, he wrote, "I will be with my men at the last moment." Beside him, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who had commanded the Japanese fleet at Pearl Harbor, also committed suicide. Their deaths symbolized not only the end of organized Japanese resistance on Saipan, but also the passing of an era. The spirit of the Imperial Japanese military, fierce, fanatical, and unyielding. When the smoke cleared, the scale of the destruction became evident. Nearly 4,000 Japanese troops had perished in the charge and the final pockets of resistance that followed. The Americans suffered over 650 casualties, including more than 400 dead, most of them from the 105th Infantry Regiment. The ground was carpeted with bodies, weapons, and shattered remnants of uniforms. For the survivors, the horror of that morning would remain etched in memory forever. The aftermath of the Banzai charge revealed both the valor and the tragedy of Saipan. For the Japanese, it was the ultimate act of defiance, a collective suicide born of honor and desperation. For the Americans, it was a grim lesson in the extremes of human warfare, a battle where mercy was impossible and survival depended on unflinching resolve. In letters home, soldiers described the charge as Hell Unleashed, a spectacle of madness that defied comprehension. The Banzai charge on Saipan marked a turning point not only in the battle, but in the Pacific War itself. It demonstrated the futility of the Japanese defense strategy, the insistence on fighting to the last man regardless of the cost. It also hardened American resolve. From this point forward, U.S. commanders would anticipate such suicidal tactics and prepare accordingly. The brutality of Saipan foreshadowed what was to come at Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. In the days that followed, the remaining Japanese soldiers were hunted down in the island's northern cliffs and caves. Many refused to surrender, choosing instead to die by their own hand. American patrols found bodies in groups, officers lying side by side, grenades still clutched in their hands. The air stank of death and decay. The island that had once been a jewel of the Pacific was now a graveyard. For the United States, the victory came at a heavy cost, but it also carried strategic significance. Saipan's capture placed American bombers within range of Tokyo itself, yet the human cost on both sides left a deep scar on all who witnessed it. Survivors of the 105th spoke of nightmares, of the cries of Banzai echoing in their ears long after the guns fell silent. The Japanese soldiers, for their part, had fulfilled their duty as they understood it, to die for the emperor. The largest banzai charge of the Pacific War thus stands as both a symbol of courage and futility. It was an act of collective sacrifice that achieved no military objective but left an indelible mark on history. In the chaos and the courage of that day, Saipan's soil absorbed the essence of a war that pitted honor against survival and ideology against humanity. It was the final convulsion of a doomed garrison, a tragic crescendo in the symphony of destruction that defined the Pacific Campaign. As the guns of war thundered across Saipan, the tragedy unfolding was not confined to soldiers alone. The island's civilians, Japanese settlers, indigenous Chamorro and Carolinian islanders, Korean laborers, and Okinawan migrants found themselves caught in a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions. By the time the battle neared its end in July 1944, Saipan had become a human nightmare. Families torn apart, thousands dead or missing, and survivors traumatized by the brutality of total war. Before the invasion, Saipan had been transformed by the Japanese Empire into a model colony and military outpost. Thousands of Japanese civilians had been encouraged to settle there under the South Seas Mandate. They built schools, farms, and businesses, and the island's capital, Garapan, flourished as a miniature version of Japan. Yet beneath this veneer of prosperity lay militarization. As war approached, the island's economy shifted toward supporting Japan's military needs. Civilians were pressed into labor, constructing fortifications, digging tunnels, and stockpiling supplies. When the American fleet appeared on the horizon in June 1944, many realized too late that they had become part of Japan's defensive perimeter. The bombardment that preceded the invasion shattered this illusion of security. Naval shells and aerial bombs rained down with devastating accuracy. Entire neighborhoods vanished in seconds. Civilians huddled in caves and makeshift shelters, clutching their children as the earth shook around them. The distinction between combatant and non-combatant ceased to exist. When the Marines landed on June 15, terrified civilians fled deeper inland, some seeking protection from the Japanese army, others merely trying to survive. For many Japanese civilians, indoctrination played a fatal role in their fate. From childhood, they had been taught that Americans were brutal monsters who would torture and kill captives. As U.S. forces advanced, propaganda intensified. Japanese officers spread rumors that surrender meant humiliation or death. Leaflets urged civilians to die honorably rather than fall into enemy hands. This toxic blend of fear and nationalism culminated in one of the most heartbreaking episodes of the Pacific War, the mass suicides at Marpy Point. By early July, the northern cliffs of Saipan, known as Suicide Cliff and Bonsai Cliff, became scenes of mass death. Entire families, fathers, mothers, children, and the elderly gathered on the precipices overlooking the sea. Some prayed, others sang the Japanese national anthem. Many clasped grenades to their chests or jumped hand in hand into the waves below. American troops who arrived too late could only watch in horror as hundreds leapt to their deaths. The air was filled with screams, explosions, and the sound of bodies striking the rocks below. Efforts by American interpreters and Japanese-speaking soldiers to prevent the suicides were met with limited success. Loudspeakers blared messages promising humane treatment and medical care, but mistrust ran too deep. In some cases, Japanese officers even forced civilians to kill themselves, fearing that capture would bring shame upon the empire. The psychological weight of these events would haunt survivors and witnesses alike for decades. Many American veterans describe the suicides as the most haunting memory of their service in the Pacific. Among the indigenous Chamorro and Carolinian islanders, the suffering was equally profound. Although not combatants, they were forced to endure bombing, starvation, and displacement. Their villages were destroyed, their lands turned into battlefields. Many were conscripted by the Japanese as laborers or porters, often under brutal conditions. After the battle, survivors emerged from hiding, emaciated, traumatized, and homeless. The island's cultural fiber, nurtured for centuries, lay in ruins. The Korean laborers, brought to Saipan under coercive conditions, faced their own tragedy. Many were forced to dig trenches, haul ammunition, and work in dangerous proximity to the front lines. When the battle turned against Japan, they too were treated as expendable. Some were executed by retreating Japanese soldiers who feared betrayal. Others perished in the bombardment. Only a fraction survived to tell their stories, stories long overlooked in the broader narrative of the Pacific War. The human cost of Saipan defied easy reckoning. Of the 25,000 Japanese civilians, it is estimated that more than 20,000 perished, many by their own hands. Their surviving population, numbering only a few thousand, was interned by American forces and eventually repatriated after the war. For the Chamorro and Carolinian Islanders, the toll was smaller in number, but devastating in proportion, as their way of life was forever altered. In the aftermath, American forces undertook a massive effort to care for the survivors. Field hospitals treated thousands of civilians for burns, malnutrition, and wounds. Chaplains and medics comforted orphans and the elderly. Military photographers captured images of Marines cradling infants and sharing rations with weeping mothers, poignant glimpses of humanity amid horror. Yet even as the survivors were tended to, the question lingered: could this tragedy have been avoided? The psychological wounds inflicted on both sides were deep and enduring. American soldiers, hardened by combat, found themselves emotionally broken by what they had witnessed. Many had entered the war believing in a clear moral divide, good versus evil. But on Saipan, the sight of civilians leaping to their deaths blurred those boundaries. The cost of victory now included moral trauma. For the Japanese, the memory of Saipan became a symbol of both sacrifice and delusion, a national wound that would haunt post-war consciousness. After the war, Saipan was rebuilt under American administration, but the ghosts of 1944 never truly faded. Memorials were erected at Suicide Cliff and Bonsai Cliff, where visitors still come to pay respect to the dead. Japanese pilgrims weep openly, leaving flowers and prayers. Chamorro and Carolinian descendants continued to tell stories of hiding in caves and losing loved ones. The island, once a symbol of imperial ambition, has become a site of shared mourning, a reminder of the universality of human suffering in war. The tragedy of Saipan civilians stands as one of the most poignant episodes in the Pacific Campaign. It revealed the devastating consequences of war propaganda, the fragility of truth under totalitarianism, and the immense human capacity for both cruelty and compassion. Amid the ruins, acts of kindness, a Marine saving a child, a nurse tending to a wounded mother, shone as faint beacons of hope. But for the thousands who perished, Saipan would remain forever a place of sorrow, where the line between war and humanity was lost to the abyss of history. When the last echoes of gunfire faded over Saipan in July 1944, the island lay in ruins, and yet the battle's end marked one of the most decisive turning points of the Pacific War. The American victory on Saipan was not merely a tactical success. It was a strategic triumph that altered the course of history. The capture of the island placed the Japanese homeland within direct striking distance of American bombers, opened the door for further advances toward the Philippines and Okinawa. The cost of victory, however, was staggering. The U.S. 10th Army and the Marine divisions suffered over 14,000 casualties, including more than 3,400 killed. For the Japanese, the defeat was catastrophic. Nearly 30,000 soldiers and more than 20,000 civilians perished. Saipan's landscape, its beaches, villages, and mountains, had become a graveyard. The scale of the devastation shocked even seasoned war correspondents who arrived in the aftermath. The strategic significance of Saipan stemmed from its location. Situated in the Mariana Islands, roughly 1,200 miles from Tokyo, Saipan offered the United States a base from which to launch long-range B-29 Superfortress bombers against the Japanese home islands. From the newly constructed airfields of Islay and Kobler, the U.S. Army Air Forces could now reach Japan's industrial heartland. The island thus became a linchpin in the American strategy of island hopping. In Washington, news of Saipan's capture was greeted with jubilation. But in Tokyo, it triggered a political earthquake. The defeat exposed the vulnerability of the Japanese Empire and shattered the illusion of invincibility. On July 18, 1944, Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, the architect of Japan's war strategy, resigned along with his cabinet, marking the first major political collapse of the Japanese wartime government. The loss of Saipan was more than a battlefield setback. For American forces, the occupation of Saipan began an arduous process of reconstruction and stabilization. Engineers and Seabees transformed the devastated island into a forward operating base. Runways were extended, hospitals built, and supply depots established. Thousands of Japanese prisoners of war were processed and interned, while surviving civilians were relocated to camps where they received food, shelter, and medical attention. Yet the atmosphere remained tense. Saipan's fall also had far-reaching implications for the next phases of the Pacific Campaign. From its airfields, the U.S. launched the first direct air raids on Tokyo in November 1944. The B-29 bombing campaign that followed devastated Japanese cities, crippled industry, and eroded morale. Saipan thus became the foundation of America's strategic air offensive, a bridgehead that connected the Pacific battlefront with the Japanese homeland. Without Saipan, the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. On a human level, the battle's aftermath was equally transformative. For many American veterans, Saipan represented both victory and trauma. The brutal fighting, the mass suicides of civilians, and the sheer scale of death left emotional scars that lasted long after the war ended. Veterans' memoirs described nightmares, guilt, and a sense of moral unease. For the Japanese survivors, the loss of Saipan symbolized the end of the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. In the post-war years, Saipan emerged as a focal point for remembrance and reconciliation. The island, once a fortress of empire, became a place of pilgrimage. Japanese families returned to search for the remains of loved ones. Memorials were erected. The Peace Memorial Park near Bonsai Cliff, the Last Command Post near Mount Marpi, and the American Memorial Park overlooking the landing beaches. These monuments, both solemn and serene, marked the collision of forces, the contradictions of war, and the sacrifices made. For the indigenous Chamorro and Carolinian people, the war's aftermath was a time of profound change. Under American administration, Saipan was transformed into a strategic territory of the United States. While Reconstruction brought economic growth, it also meant cultural and political displacement. Traditional lands were repurposed for military use, and the island's identity evolved under external influence. Yet the resilience of the native population endured, shaping a new Saipan, one that embraced its complex history while striving for a brighter future. The victory on Saipan also influenced the moral and strategic calculations leading to the end of the war. The ferocity of the Japanese defense convinced American planners that an invasion of the home islands would result in unimaginable casualties. The experiences of Saipan, and later Okinawa, directly informed the decision to use atomic bombs in 1945. Military and political leaders viewed the bombings as a way to avoid another Saipan on a far greater scale. In retrospect, the Battle of Saipan encapsulated the paradox of modern warfare: progress through destruction, victory through loss. The island that had once been a tropical paradise became both a symbol of American determination and a monument to human suffering. Its capture signaled the beginning of Japan's end, but also marked a new era in global warfare, one dominated by air power, total mobilization, and the blurring of lines between soldier and civilian. Today, Saipan stands as a quiet island once more, its cliffs and beaches washed clean by the tides of time. Tourists walk where soldiers fought, and children play near memorials that whisper of past horrors. The jungles have reclaimed the battlefields, but beneath the soil lie the relics of that fateful summer: helmets, bullets, bones. Every gust of wind that passes over Suicide Cliff seems to carry the echoes of those who perished there. Their sacrifice, whether in victory or in defeat. The legacy of Saipan endures not only in the history books, but in the lessons it imparts: that war spares no one, that courage and compassion coexist with cruelty and despair, and that peace, though fragile, is worth every cost. The victory on Saipan was more than a military conquest. It was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a grim milestone on the path to ending the deadliest conflict in human history, and a solemn reminder that even in triumph, humanity must confront the shadows it has